A very wonderful day to you all, my dear students. Today we are going to listen to a wonderful lesson named A Nice Cup of Tea by George Orwell. I'll repeat the lesson name again. A Nice Cup of Tea by George Orwell. I guess most of you love to drink tea, isn't it? It makes you feel enthusiastic and excited when you take a cup of tea in the morning hours to make your day active. Okay. More than 70 years ago, in the year 1946 of January 12th, in an edition of the Evening Standard, George Orwell wrote up 11 tips for making and consuming tea. So, this lesson is about points given by George Orwell about the preparation and consuming tea. So, before we go into the lesson, let's know a little about the birthplace of tea, or as we call it as chai. The history of tea dates back to the ancient China almost 5,000 years ago. According to a legend, Emperor Shen Nung discovered tea when leaves from a wild tree blew into his pot of boiling water. He was immediately interested in the pleasant scent of the resulting brew and drank some. The legend says the emperor described a warm feeling as he drank the intriguing brew, as if the liquid was investigating every part of his body. So, as I told you, what happens when you drink tea? It gives you an excited feeling. So, moving into the lesson, let's read. You can listen to me as I read. If you look up tea in the first cookery book that comes to hand, you will probably find that it is unmentioned, or at most you will find a few lines of sketchy instructions which give no ruling on several of the most important points. Mostly, if someone is asked how do you prepare tea, they just tell you, take a pot, add some tea leaves, pour water, boil it, add sugar and drink. But here, George Orwell discusses, or he just gives us points as of how to make a perfect tea. He calls it as a perfect cup of tea. And the points that he discusses, he calls them as golden points. Firstly, one should use Indian or Ceylonese tea. If you can see the picture, you will find what is an Indian tea and a Ceylonese tea. He says it is economical and one can drink tea without milk. He says China tea has virtues which one cannot despise, but there is not much stimulation in it, and he says one does not feel wiser, braver, or more positive after drinking it. So, anyone who has used that comforting phrase, a nice cup of tea, would always choose Indian tea or Ceylonese tea. The second golden rule is that tea should be made in small quantities. That is, it should be made only in teapot. A tea out of an urn is always tasteless. He says a tea which is made in a big vessel is always tasteless. So he says tea out of an urn is always tasteless, and he says the teapot should be made only of china or earthenware. He also says a teapot that is made of silver or Britannia ware produces inferior tea, and enamel pots are worse. So he recommends tea to be made only in teapots which are made of earthenware. Thirdly, the pot should be warmed beforehand. That is, it should be placed on a stove burner in order to make the pot little hot before you pour water and put in the tea leaves. Rule number 4. One strong cup of tea is better than 20 weak ones. He says all true tea lovers not only like their tea strong, but like it a little stronger with each year that passes. He says to make a tea strong, it is enough to use 6 heaped teaspoons in order to have a perfect cup of tea. To rule number 5, tea should be put straight into the pot. That is, no strainers, New Zealand bags, or other devices should be used to imprison the tea. In some countries, teapots are fitted with little dangling baskets under the spout to catch the stray leaves, which are supposed to be harmful. Actually speaking, one can swallow tea leaves in considerable quantities without ill effect. And if the tea is not loose in the pot, it never infuses properly to give you a better aroma. Rule number 6. One should take the teapot to the kettle and not the other way about. That is, the water should be actually boiling at the moment of impact. So keep it on the flame while pouring. Some people add that one should only use water that has been freshly brought to the boil. But he says he had never noticed that it makes any difference. Rule number 7. Once the tea is brewed, one should stir it, or better, give the pot a good shake. So either you use a spoon to stir it, or you use the pot and give it a good shake. And then you must allow the tea leaves to settle. Now on to rule number 8. One should drink tea out of a good breakfast cup. That is, it should be a cylindrical type of a cup which holds more tea, and not the flat or a shallow type. Usually, the breakfast cup holds more tea, and if it is going to be a shallow or a flat type, even before one could start drinking it, the tea would be half cold. Rule number 9. One should pour the cream off the milk before using it for tea. Milk that is too creamy always gives tea a sickly taste. So people who prefer a perfect cup of tea avoid using creamy milk. Moving on to rule number 10. He says one should pour a tea into the cup first. This is one of the most controversial points of all. Indeed, in every family in Britain, there are probably 2 ways of dealing with drinking a cup of tea. One side states milk has to be poured in first. And the second states tea has to be poured in first. Orwell himself is unanswerable to this. He says, by putting the tea in first and stirring as one pours the milk, one can exactly regulate the amount of milk, whereas one is liable to put in too much milk if one does it the other way round. Last point, Orwell says, tea, unless one is drinking it in the Russian style, it should be drunk only without sugar. He says, how can anyone call himself a true tea lover if he destroys the flavor of tea by adding sugar in it? So he says, tea is meant to be bitter. If you sweeten it, you are no longer tasting the tea, but you are merely tasting the sugar. So some people would say that if you add sugar to tea, it is only going to stimulate. But as of Orwell, drinking tea in the Russian style makes him feel much better. These are not the only controversial points to arise in connection with drinking tea, but they are sufficient to show how subtilized the whole business has become. When we are able to pay so much attention in everything that we do, don't you think it's worth paying attention to even small details in preparing a cup of tea? Isn't it? So go ahead, prepare a cup of tea for yourself, and have a good day. Thank you.